Take me a moment to get going. I don't do this very often anymore. And I actually emailed myself notes that were for something else. And so I'm going to have to go off of my memory. If Malcolm X were alive today, he would be 90 years old. And if we look at that in and of itself, just a black man born in 1925 to have lived through the Jim Crow era, to have lived through the sharecropping era, peonage laws and all of those things that were really just a de facto form of slavery, to have lived through the height of the civil rights movement, which became the Black Liberation Movement later, and through the period of reaction and after the violent crushing of the Black liberation movement, as well as the liberation movements of other oppressed peoples, indigenous people, Mexican people, Puerto Rican people, as well as the crushing of the left movement and around the world, and the crushing of the liberation movements in other parts of the world as well, and the period of reaction that came after that, the neo-colonial governments that sprang up. To have lived through that would be a feat in and of itself. Even if he did not become Malcolm X and he had stayed Malcolm Little his entire life, to live through that as a black person would be something that is very extraordinary for anyone to live to be 90. But he isn't alive now. He has gone away, and I don't mean that in a passive way, even though my words seem passive. He was violently ripped away, murdered by the state in collusion with other forces. At the height of his strength as an orator as well as a political organizer, and right at the cusp before the explosion of the militant wing of the black movement. But his legacy, I don't like to, whenever people sometimes try to imagine what someone might say if they were alive now, and I don't think that so much matters. There have been a lot of revolutionaries who have lived throughout the years, and maybe they went on to do other things in their life or just to have a life. Robert F. Williams in his last few years, stayed with his family, got to know his family, and he died a relatively quiet life. He wasn't completely removed from the political arena. For the most part, he had chosen a quiet life after being exiled from this country, forbidden to come back after they had these phony charges against him of kidnapping, so on and so forth. And other people whose politics have gone rightward, moderated, and it's hard to say what is going to happen. That was a very difficult period for a lot of people to live through politically, especially in the liberation struggles, to see your comrades and your friends murdered, to live through the raids. I don't know if anyone is here. I've had my home raided, and it was just that was a different period. There was a political struggle in Denver when it happened, but it wasn't as if they were actively going out and murdering people in the streets. I just happened to be someone they picked off. But to have that be common course within the struggle, it makes it very hard, and to see everything go away, I can't imagine what it must be like for people. So we don't know what Malcolm would say. But we look towards his legacy and the import it had for the movements that sprang shortly after his death, and what it would mean for us today going forward to develop the political struggle. This isn't so much a talk on Malcolm X himself, but to use, that in the entire history of the black struggle here in this country up until today, and it helps point us in a direction of how things are developing and what the prospects are for greater struggle in this country, not just in the oppressed communities, but generally speaking as well. And I think it's important for us to look at what is actually happening after Baltimore. And I don't know if a lot of people remember. I remember because I spent a lot of time in Baltimore. And Baltimore had become a second home for me. I was down there almost every week, or every weekend, or every other week, spending a lot of time with the comrades. And maybe not everybody remembers, but Sharon would say to me very often that Baltimore is seething and it's going to explode. She's just watch. Sometimes it seems like nothing is happening, But all the conditions that are there, that exist anywhere else, they're amplified in Baltimore. Multiply that by 100 times, and then you have Baltimore. And it happened. And we can say that it happened because of the murder yet of another young black life. This young man, Freddie Gray, who was tortured to death by the police, tackled, had his spine broken and his vocal cords snapped. But that was just a catalyst, because there have been a number of police killings in Baltimore. But if you haven't seen Baltimore, imagine Detroit imagine Detroit if the walls are closing in on it from all sides. That's Baltimore. It's a much smaller area where you might go to a neighborhood and you might see in a row homes, 4 homes boarded up and 1 not boarded up. And sometimes you see people living in boarded up homes. They come out of the wood, and you have to really search for something as simple as a grocery store, or for a loaf of bread, or for a vegetable or an apple. You can go in New York, you go on the corner, you find a fruit stand, and you can get some grapes, an apple, an orange, kiwi, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries. You don't have that in Baltimore. If you're a young person in Baltimore and you're looking for a recreation center, or even a firehouse, you know one reason why those fires burnt so long in Baltimore? Because they closed a lot of the firehouses within the city limits. That's part of the reason they burned so long. But the rebellion in Baltimore was all of those things. It was the conditions that prevailed throughout the entire city of Baltimore, the things that most people only know because they watch the television show The Wire. The fact that schools have been closed down, recreation centers closed down, firehouses closed down, how they destroyed the docks and all of the other industrial plants that existed in Baltimore and outside of Baltimore, and the fact that the unemployment rate is at a genocidal level in Baltimore, especially for young people that are a generation younger than me, that are just coming out of high school and have nothing to look for their future. Where you can barely get a bus, and cabs don't go to West Baltimore, and so people have an underground way of actually getting from place to place, and it's called hacking, and that's how the people survive. Where the city doesn't care about Baltimore, where they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Inner Harbor and other areas to build them up for new white folks that are moving into Baltimore, but they don't care about the areas where the black people live, which is about 70% of the population. You know, an interesting fact, if you want to know what actually led to the rebellion, the first day of it, I'm not talking about when the cops had surrounded Mondawmin Mall and they had canceled buses so the kids couldn't get from their school to home and the cops were harassing people. That was a different day. But the very first day when we were there, when we marched downtown and we went to where the Orioles play, what is the name of that park? Camden Yards, and you had all these white people behind a row of police that were taunting and calling us niggers and honking their horns and throwing up their middle fingers, and people who, the entire march was peaceful and people just expressing their democratic will, and you have these white families that are clutching all of their things and running by and saying, we got to get out of here, and treating us like we're some animals. People throwing things. This is what led to the rebellion. It was the meeting of two worlds. It was the meeting of Baltimore as it is today, and the Baltimore that the city wants to build as they kick black people out of our communities. The violent process that people call this very tame word, gentrifying. Well, you know, gentrification, it's a process that develops. It's not just the developers coming in. It's the entire period of white flight from these particular areas, the divestment from these areas, the closing up down of the schools in these areas, and the quality of life ordinances which lead to people feeling that they're actually not feeling, which lead to the occupation of these communities by the police. And it's almost very similar, I wrote in my article, it's almost similar in some ways, to the conditions that led for black people to leave the South. It's these repressive conditions that force people out of the city areas and force them to the outskirts surrounding the city. And so that's part of the reason you have this growth, this exponential growth of what they call suburban poverty. It's not that the people who had lived in the suburban areas for 20, 30, maybe 40 years are getting poor. It's just that those people are coming in after this violent process that is leading to people being kicked out of their neighborhoods. The developers come in, buy up this land, create minimum income requirements, and these people move back into the city center, and the people who once lived there move on to outerlying areas. Away from their jobs, away from their schools, away from their friends, homes, families are broken up. They've closed public housing. They've broken up families through that process, and people just go where they can go. So they go to the outerlying areas, or in some cases, you have people migrating back to the South, back to the Black Belt South in some cases. If we were to look at, when I'm talking about the material basis, I want to get into this whole, we're not going to go through the entire 30, 40, 50 years since Malcolm was actually killed. You don't have to actually look that far, but most of us can imagine having been around that time and understanding the political process in this country, understanding, the technological boom and what that meant to working people, and that a lot of working people in these areas in the North, in the former industrial sector, were black, and how they were the first to be cast off from their jobs, and that their future generations, even I, as a kid, who had parents who worked in factories, wanted to work at General Electric. When the white kids were bringing their parents in for parent day and they were saying their jobs, I was like, my dad builds locomotives and locomotive parts. He built electrical engines. Didn't have a high school diploma, but at that time you could go and get these jobs and be trained for good union jobs and survive and raise a family off of them, and that's gone. And people have no place to go, and they're being pushed into the service sector. If you can get a job at McDonald's, if you can get a job. And in order to talk about the material basis, we have to talk about this whole period of people feeling as if they have nothing left to lose. That that there is no jobs, there are no jobs for them, they have no access to education, and that they feel that they have this permanent second-class citizenship within this country, and that they are preyed upon by the police constantly, where you can't leave your home. You see, I see all these videos now on Facebook that people put these experiments on racism. And you see that and you might think, oh my God, that is horrible. But let me walk you through a day in the life of a black father, just so you can understand it better, because I can tell you. The things that most people love about when someone has their child with them, you don't have that when you're a black parent. I only know as my experience as a black father. People don't look at you and say, oh, isn't that wonderful? They look at you with disgust. Oh man, I bet you they're taking money from it. It's my tax money. You might go into a restaurant and you could sit for 15, 20 minutes after asking somebody to bring you a high chair and they never bring it to you. People will come up to you and say, is that your child? This is to me. Is that your child? That can't possibly be your child. You sit down somewhere, people will move away from you. They don't want to sit next to you. If you have a child, if you're carrying that child on your chest, you're wearing them, they won't give you a seat. This is just a little bit of what it's like to be black in this society. So imagine this, the everyday response you get from regular people, regular white people, and imagine the response you get from the police, because they have the power to brutalize you and to arrest you, and a lot of times you feel like there's nothing that you can actually do about it. You feel powerless. Most black people, it's not just the particular cases of black people that are being killed. It's not just Freddie Gray. Because if you talk to everybody in that neighborhood, they have a similar story. They just were able to walk away from it. They understand that they could potentially be the next Freddie Gray, or the next Eric Garner, or the next Michael Brown. You don't feel safe within your community. You don't feel quite human because people don't look at you that way. Look at what happened with this young man in Boston, Osama Rahim. We have to talk about that, right? Because it's not disconnected from what's happening in the wake of this Black Lives Matter explosion in this country. You would think that the police found Osama bin Laden hiding out in Roxbury. That's the way that CNN has treated it, isn't it? Fox News, MSNBC, ever since they shot this man, they've been going on the news and say we broke up a potential ISIS cell, a homegrown terrorist cell. And we know that if you really want to find supporters, material supporters of ISIS, you need look no further than the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. You can go on Capitol Hill and throw a stone at a politician, and I bet you they're one of the ones that supported arming these factions to overthrow a government in Syria, as well as supporting the war in Iraq and the bombing of Libya, the bombing of Yemen, and all these conditions, these military conditions that have created the rise of this ISIS. The reality is that this young man, I don't know what was going on in his life, but I do know that he was black and he was a black Muslim. And that there would be 1,000,001 reasons for a black person to want to strike out and fight the police in this society. I just named some of them, but you can name more. Aiyana Jones, she was 7 years old when she was burnt and shot in her home in Detroit. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, had a little pellet gun. If you're white, you can go into Hartsfield Atlanta Airport, which is the busiest airport in the world, and you can have a semi-automatic assault rifle, and the police aren't going to shoot you. They're going to treat you very humane, but if you're black, you can't have even a tiny little knife in your hand or a toy pellet gun. See, because Tamir Rice, the cop didn't even step foot outside of his car before he shot him. He opened the door, put one foot out, and shot the little boy and killed him. So there's many reasons why a person would want to fight the police. Not saying that that's what we tell people. We believe that the way forward is through organizing, but I can understand that type of anger that comes from young people. So the police say that they had been surveilling this young man, Usama, a brother and a son, a father, a husband. I think he had 2 children, for 2 years, and that they had recorded a conversation that he had with somebody where he was saying, I think at one point they say he threatened Pamela Geller. Does everybody know who Pamela Geller is? She's that horrible, racist, ultra-reactionary person who champions the murders of Palestinian and Muslim people all over the world. She's very violent with her language. She's put posters on buses and posters on, in the subway stations that are really pushing people towards this violent, reactionary, anti-Muslim sentiment, like the bikers down in Texas where they surrounded that mosque. So they had been monitoring him for 2 years and following some of his social media comments, so they say, and that they had recorded a conversation a couple of days before the incident with him where he was saying in code that he was going to go after police. So with no arrest warrant, with no warrant of any kind, they approached this young man, and that leads to his death. And they say we have video that shows that he had a knife, and most people that have seen the video that comment and say you can't tell what he has in his hand, and that he was set up and he was killed by the police. And so they plaster his picture around and put this on, and this is very calculated. This is very similar to what happened when the cops were shot here in New York. Do you remember that? And they wanted to tie it to the Black Lives Matter movement. It is very similar. See, these things aren't separate. If you even look at Baltimore, and they talk every day, you go on the news, they say there's a rise in violence in Baltimore. The gangs are fighting again. I went to LA in 1992. I was in the Nation of Islam after the gang truce, actually it was 93, it was a year after that. Savior's Day, the Nation of Islam was in LA that year. And I was able to meet, I was like 17, I was able to meet some of the youth of the street organizations, the leadership of the street organizations. And even then, they were saying that the police were trying to start the conflicts up again. So you can imagine who is creating the conditions in Baltimore so that they can say they're creating a condition where people will be loath to want to convict these police who have been tried for the murder of Freddie Gray. to where they can say that the police are our heroes. See, this is what happens when you go against the police. Violence ticks up. This is why we need them in the community. This is why we need broken windows. This is why we need stop and frisk. This is why we need a cop on every corner harassing people as they go to school, as they come home from school. Because if not, then it's anarchy and these people just kill themselves. But I guarantee you we will find out that COINTELPRO is alive and well, and that these conditions of violence are created by the cops. Just like the shooting of Sharon Black's car a few days ago was because of the Baltimore Police Department. Make no doubt about it, if they didn't directly pull the trigger, then it had something to do with them leading someone else to pull that trigger. They are trying to win public support back because there is an anti-police sentiment. People are rising to see that the police aren't necessarily there to do our bidding or to protect and serve us. They're there to beat, murder, and control us. They're there to maintain a status quo of the rich and super rich against the poor and oppressed. And they want to change that narrative. And they're punishing people. We're not at the point in the political movement here where we can deal with the unfortunate antisocial behaviors that sometimes arise in a community. So it's understanding that when people see danger, unfortunately in a oppressed community, when they see certain situations going, they call the police. That is their right to do that. But now in Baltimore, you call the police, they don't show up. People call 911 and they can't even get through. And when they do, it takes the cops 30 minutes to come and show up. That's them saying, we're doing this because you have turned against us. But see, I think it's important, it's increasingly more important now, especially as this movement has exploded, for us to begin to make clear what the actual role of the police are in society, and to make clear what the state is in society. To show that yes, under some circumstances you will have to call them for whatever reason, but their primary role is not to protect you within your community. Their primary role is as it was when they were first formed, because the police were formed as the slave patrols. They were formed to control the slaves and to return slaves to their owners, and they were formed in the North after slavery had ceased to exist to control the working industrial populations in the city, the immigrant populations in the city that were rebelling against the conditions that they lived under. Those were the reasons that the police were formed, as a method of control, to keep people from fighting against those who are against their common interests. But to get back to where I began and to the basis of the article that I wrote a couple of papers ago, and then I'll leave it at that so Deirdre can talk. And in order for the Black Lives Matter movement to grow and to continue to develop forward, there is not only the need for a continuing education and political development of people in the struggle as to the nature of the state, the nature of the police, as well as the nature of the bourgeois government and who it actually serves to protect, but there is an importance to show those who may not necessarily be in the movement and may have a hard time understanding the movement, the connection of this to the long process of deindustrialization and a casting off of workers, but also the neoliberal process that has led to the destruction of the inner city areas, the cutting back on an important social safety net that is disappearing every year. They cut back more, whether it's food stamps, whether it's TANF, they cut more and more. They're closing more schools. They're increasing the privatization of the schools. All the things that were fought for generations ago, Social Security, Medicare, all these things are in danger of being cut. And the reason why these things are happening is because of the banks and the financial institutions who are more and more robbing the public treasuries at every level. This is neoliberalism within the imperialist center, and you see it more than just in the US, but you see it around the globe and the other imperialist countries as well. And so that is the reason why we built the process of the tribunal that is an ongoing process, and is the reason why we need to go back to the People's Power Assembly model, and it is the reason why the comrades have developed the tribunal this Saturday in Baltimore for those who are able to go. We understand that in order to develop it forward, we have to begin to talk about the connection of the state, what the state actually is, to these prevailing conditions in the capitalist system itself, and to show that the way forward is, of course, we want to fight for incremental gains, whether it is calling for a cop to be indicted, to be tried, and for them to be convicted and put underneath the prison, whether it's calling for body cameras even though we know, look, Eric Garner's murder was filmed and it did not make a difference. Rodney King's beating was filmed, it did not make a difference. Tamir Rice, that's on camera, it did not make a difference. But the community has a right to demand that, and it's a way, and we have to support that demand as a way of going forward, calling for an end to broken windows, stop and frisk, and all these other quality of life ordinances that are really just occupations that gives them legal cover to occupy oppressed communities. It is important to fight for these things, but it's much more important to go forward to understand who our enemy is and to begin to fight for political independence from the mainstream bourgeois parties, and to begin to fight over the important resources that are being robbed from us, to fight for control of our communities, even control of the police until we're able to police our own communities, and to fight ultimately to overturn a brutal repressive system that the police and the state serves to keep in place. So with that, comrades, I've gone over my time quite a bit. I always say it feels like you've been up here for 5 minutes and maybe 30 has passed. So another 30, it'll just feel like 10, 15 minutes to me. But I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak here. You know, most of the day I'm saying, put that down, get off of that, leave that alone. What'd you just put in your mouth? Open your mouth, give me that. Why are you yelling at me? Go to sleep, it's time to go to bed now. That's the extent of my conversations during the day. So I hope you excuse me if I did ramble a little bit, because talking to real grown adults is not something that I'm used to. So thank you.